Alrighty, so hello everybody. In this video, we'll be going through activity 2 and 3, password strength strong. So you should have ended up reading through the e-text. We're going to be going through the two-word function section, as well as the two-word and a digit function in this video. So what they end up prompting us to do in the e-text page is they want us to take a password as an input that is a combination of two commonly used words as a password. What we can do is we can create code that's going to guess this password just by using brute force. And so what that means is we're going to be going through all the potential options of what we could have and literally just test out every single one of those possible scenarios. So the eText ends up providing us the dictionary.txt file, which contains 26,000 most commonly used words for passwords. So we want to be able to create code that will go through all the possible combinations of any of these two words that could be used for the passwords. So first off, let's first simplify this, right? We always want to simplify things first in our code and then start to make them more complex. So let's just imagine that the dictionary.txt file only had three words, and those three words were PW, Apple, and password. We might know that the password is a combination of two of these words, right? And so if it is, we could then end up creating code that will be able to generate the following possibilities that I've listed below. We could end up seeing if we've generated one of the possibilities that are actually indeed the password. So if you end up looking at this, I want you to be thinking, how could we actually be able to create this pattern in our code? Where we have it PW, PW, PW Apple, PW password. And so what I'm noticing is that this first word is remaining the same, and then we're going through all the potential options for word 2. Then what happens after we run through all the options of word 2, word 1 is then incremented. And then we run through all those options again for word 2, and then we increment word 1 once again, where we get to the last one. And then we end up going through all those possible outcomes for word 2. And so this is generating all the different potential word combinations we could have, two-word combinations, that is, from our words list. And so we could end up creating code that looks something like this, where we have the potential words that could be used, and then we end up using a nested for loop here. And so that nested for loop is going to iterate through words here, assigning word 1. It's also going to iterate through word 2. Or words, and assign the loop variable to be word 2. My apologies. Then we're going to print out those combinations. And so what you'll end up seeing is if you end up throwing this code into VS Code, you're going to end up seeing all these different potential outcomes here, right? So now, just as we said, this is a very simple example, right? Our actual dictionary.txt file contains a little bit over 26,000 words that we want to end up using. So what we can do is instead of using this simple 3-element list, we can use that entire file. And so we can end up creating a function that's called getDictionary. And what we can do is we can create an empty words list. We can then end up opening our dictionary file, right? The dictionary.txt file. Then we could iterate through each of those lines, right? Now, what we want to do is we want to omit that /n that is at the very, very end of that. And so we can end up using this indexing, right, where it's going to take that string index and it's going to remove basically that last character in there, which they end up counting the /n as one character itself. And so that's basically what this is doing. It's removing that /n. And so what we can do is we can close the dictionary file, and then words, it's going to be all of our entries there that contain all of the words, the most commonly used words, right, the 26,000 words. And so then what we could end up doing is we can assign words to be equal to that list that was returned, right, from getDictionary. We can end up setting guesses equal to 0. Then we can end up using that same code that we had before, right, for word 1 in words, and then for word 2 in words, and we'll iterate through all of those possibilities, right, for those two words. We're going to increment guesses each time. Then we can end up concatenating word 2 and word 1 together. And then we can set up an if statement if those two words concatenated together is equal to our password. Then what we want to do is we want to return true, because we ended up finding our password. And then we also want to return guesses so that we can know how many guesses it took to actually get to this password. Now, outside of these nested for loops, we end up having the return false and then guesses. Now, why is that? It is because false It's false because in that case, if we get to this point where it's returning false in guesses, we did not actually guess the password, right? It wasn't containing a word or the words from our dictionary.txt file. And so then what we can end up doing is we can have the user input a 2-word password that we want our code to be able to guess. If it is found, it will end up printing out here, password found equals true, and then it will tell us how many guesses it took, right? And so this is returning these 2 variables here. One other thing I want to mention, it's returning 2 variables because as you can see, we have return true, comma, guesses there. We have return false, comma, guesses. And so since we're returning 2 values, we can end up assigning 2 values to that. All right, so moving on to the next part, I want you to try and adjust your code so that the password is a combination of not only 2 words, but also it's going to include a digit. So the digit could be placed at the beginning of the phrase, or it could also be placed at the end of the phrase. So I want you to take that into consideration as well. Once you've got your code, you can unpause this, and then you can move to this next slide. So this is the actual code that we'd want to end up using. Please do keep in mind, this guy is actually supposed to be get_dictionary. So let me make that change here. So words equals get dictionary. So you'll remember that's going to assign a list of, or it's going to assign words to become a list of all the different words that were in that text file. We're going to set guesses equal to 0. And then now what we're doing, what we're implementing in here now is we have a string containing all of the digits 0 through 9. And so what we can end up doing is we can use that same nested for loop, and then we're going to actually iterate through all the digit possibilities too. And so it's going to go for d in digits, where the guesses is going to increment by 1. And then what we're going to do is we're going to first test if the digits at the end of that, right? And so if the word 1 plus word 2 plus d equals password, then we're going to return true and then the amount of guesses, right? Now, else, what we want to do is we want to increment guesses by 1 more time, because we are now placing d, the digit, in the beginning of that phrase that we're guessing. So then we want to create an if statement. If d plus word 1 plus word 2 equals password, then we want to return true and then also the amount of guesses. Now, here at the very, very end, we have return false, comma, guesses. Now, why we have that at the very, very end outside of this for loop, this is going to be the case if we do not end up guessing the actual 2-word password that also includes a digit in there. It'll return false in guesses. And then so what we can do is we can end up implementing in our code, or we can change in our code. We can update it so that it'll say input a 2-word password, also containing a digit. And then we'll also end up printing this out here. And what we're also doing here is the found, comma, guesses equals, we want to now call that new function that we've created that also includes a digit in there. Okay. So that is the code that you should end up with after you move through those parts of the activity. What I want to now introduce to you all is tonight's homework. So the code that I just talked about, that we currently just designed, it can definitely be more efficient. And so for tonight's homework, I want you to plan out one idea, one algorithm. That means create pseudocode for this, create a flowchart, or even just write it out in natural language explaining it, right? If you also need to create diagrams, do that. But what we want to do is we want to get the plan that we can end up implementing later on as Python code so that it will decrease the amount of time required to actually guess either a 1-word, 2-word, or a 2-word and a digit password. So we want to make it more efficient, right? So that means maybe you end up guessing this in less guesses, or it takes less time, or maybe I should say or it takes less time. So that's what you want to keep in mind. If you're still at a loss here, some hints that I have for you all, maybe look at the length of the password that you end up guessing. Maybe you can check that with other lengths of the words that are in the dictionary. Maybe you could end up even sorting the words in the dictionary by length. Maybe you could sort them by alphabetically. Maybe you think that that has an advantage. You could also end up even testing to see if a password contains a certain word in it that's from our dictionary.txt file, right? So just as a little hint here, even further hint for your head, there is the Python in keyword. So look that up, research that if you don't know what that is. And I'm sure you'll end up finding that helpful. But that's what tonight's homework is. Tomorrow, we're going to end up implementing your actual pseudocode or your diagrams, your flowcharts that you end up creating to make our code even more efficient. Anyways, hope that video was helpful. Thank you all for checking in with me here. Wishing you all the best. Happy pseudocode creating or flowchart creating. Catch you all later in the next video. Bye-bye.